attention to Jake. Before we start, I wanted to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of respect and reconciliation, I acknowledge that I live and work on Amiskwastiwakskwe, known as Edmonton, which is home to the Nahi-Wiao, Dene, Soto, and Nakota Sioux, and Blackfoot peoples of the Treaty 6 region. My connection to this land is that of a settler, and a way that I honor that is by engaging in Indigenous-led events in my community through Indigenous Tourism Alberta. We do land acknowledgements to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relations between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and cultures. In addition to Indigenous reconciliation, another one of our areas of focus has been advancing gender equity and inclusion of the talented women at Moneris and the important role of men, which is why we're so excited about today's event, where we will be exploring what it means to be a male ally and the role men can play in gender equity. Today's keynote will be delivered by Jake Sticka, the founder of Next Gen Men and a powerful advocate for gender equity. So passing it on to you, Jake.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't normally do keynotes sitting down, but my standing desk is broken, so just going to have to deal with that today. I'm joining you all from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. That's the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, also known as Vancouver. You know, I'm grateful, Daman, for the land acknowledgement that you did, and it's really cool that you're putting that extra initiative into doing some Indigenous tourism. I think it's really important to do land acknowledgements in a way that isn't just kind of a checkbox activity, and that's something that at Next Gen Men we've been thinking a lot about as well. And as of earlier this year, we actually made the decision that on a quarterly basis, we'll be taking a percentage of our proceeds from talks like this one and contributing to a local Indigenous group working towards reconciliation or working to advance reconciliation and Indigenous sovereignty. So really love to hear that. So let's jump into it. Today's talk is titled Moving Beyond Male Allies, and to set it up, I want to share with you 3 ways that I learned to be a man. The first way that I learned to be a man is this idea of the gentleman. And I really remember it. I was probably about 7, 8 years old, and I was riding public transit with my grandmother. And I had a seat, she had a seat, and there was an elderly man who got on transit using a cane. And she nudged me, because it was a pretty full tram, that I should get up and I should give up my seat. And, you know, your grandmother at 7, 8 years old, who's going to have ice cream for you later, nudges you, you're like, okay, I'll get up. But then she took the opportunity to teach me a lesson about that. And she said that when you're young and healthy, therefore, if you have privileges that other people don't have, you should give up your spot, especially to people that are older than you, women, those with children. When you're 7 years old, everyone's older than you. So it was a regular practice for me whenever I was on public transit with my grandmother, but then also without that, with that lesson. So this was an early lesson in checking my privilege. And this idea that being a gentleman should cost you something, even if it is just your seat. And as much as I learned from my grandmother how to be a gentleman, I also learned a lot of things from my grandfather. He was more of a patriarch, and he was definitely more commanding, controlling, a breadwinner. The man worked until he was 72, and he really role modeled what the idea of being a man was as a provider. And then, you know, myself, I started living into that in a bunch of different ways. I was a doorman on and off for 10 years. If there's any Calgarians on the call, they might recognize the logo on my chest there. But it's not a hard job to get when you happen to be 6'8" and over 250 pounds. And my job there was to be a protector and to command and to control. And in that role, I witnessed people having some of the best times of their lives, bachelorette parties, celebrations, sports wins, But I also witnessed a lot of people having some of their worst moments, just overdoing it, dealing with substance abuse issues, and a lot of violence, which then led to me having some of my own worst moments there. And at that time and during that period in my life, I used violence towards justice as I understood it at the time. And the lesson that I take away from that time and period in my life is we're not defined by our worst moments. Even if we've done harm or committed abuse, we can contribute to healing and transformation. I think a lot of the discourse we have today is, if you've ever done anything problematic, you should probably just be quiet and kind of sit aside. But if that was the case, then I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do. And I also learned that equity and standing up for others and justice requires courage, especially in spaces where the people that you're advocating for don't have presence, don't have power, like locker rooms, like boardrooms, or like pubs. And the last way that I learned to be a man was the Stoic. This is my father here at a Flames game. I know that Neetu really wanted me to shout out the Calgary Flames, even though we're not in the playoffs. But I'll do that. And this on his face is what constitutes a smile. And I'm often asked, how did I get into this work anyways? And despite my own privilege as a tall, straight white male, I struggle with mental health. In my late teens, I dealt with depression, and at the time, my coping mechanisms were binge drinking and fistfights. And I ended up dropping out of the first university that I went to where I played basketball. And that was my entire identity at the time. And then I, got myself together, went to another school, walked onto the next basketball team, became a Canadian All-Academic, had my first kind of serious relationship. Life was on a good path. And at 22, I'm hit with depression again. And I really had to face, why is this happening? And at that time, my coping mechanism was self-harm, which led me to counseling and therapy. And dating a women's studies grad, I really came to understand it was this masculine script that was harming me. You got to be tough. You should never show emotion. You should never ask for help. And the worst part, the insidious part in that is there was nobody external to me telling me those things. It was all stuff that I'd internalized over my life. My father didn't necessarily say those words, even though he wasn't very emotional growing up. My partner was very supportive. I had great friends. It was that social kind of soup that I was cooked in. And then while I was going through that, my best friend, who I co-founded the organization with, unfortunately lost his 13-year-old brother to suicide in 2007. He was a young Black youth experiencing homophobic bullying. And, through Jamal's loss and grief and my own struggles, I think we formed a very unique male friendship that a lot of guys don't necessarily have, based on vulnerability, emotional support, being there for one another. So that was kind of, my Spider-Man moment when the spider bit me. And so today we're going to be talking about how we move beyond male allies. And in order to do that, I do believe we have to change the way we see, act, and think about masculinity. And these 3 ways that I learned how to be a man are 3 ways that I thought masculinity was set up. And so this term male allies, where does that come from? Why do we hear it so much? Why is it in the mix? It's something we know we need to do, but I want to ask us as we go through this presentation and this talk, how's it going? Are guys showing up to these conversations? Do we see them leading DEI? Do we see news about the white male CEO championing diversity and inclusion and all the benefits it brings to their organizations? We're struggling a little bit on that front. And the way that I see it is we've been pushing the gas pedal for women and girls, and as well, trans and non-binary individuals, it's kind of accelerating too, but especially for women and girls over the last 70 plus years, We've shifted culture and changed norms about women's roles and norms in society, resulting in women having moved out of some of those traditional roles, whereas men still remain entrenched in a lot of these old ideas of what it means to be a man. And so we're missing this parallel conversation for, with, and about men and their traditional stereotypes and roles in society. And so we're stepping on a gas pedal while simultaneously holding a brake. And I don't know about you, but if you're a regular driver, when you do that in a car, you start to spin out. And sometimes the conversation feels a little like we're spinning out. So the first way that I think that we can change this conversation is what I call, this ally argument, overcoming the gentleman. And not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, when we say male allies, we at least know what people are getting at. And so to have this conversation, first we need to talk about what is allyship. Maybe you can throw some thumbs up in the chat if it's available to you. Do you agree with this definition? Is there any issues that you see with it, or how are you feeling about this definition of allyship? I'm not frozen. I'm just seeing. Danny says it's an ideal. Nicole threw me a thumbs up. Okay. I like this definition too. I take one major issue with it, is that allyship is a verb and not a noun. It's not a title. It's someone who actively supports and defends the rights and dignity of individuals from social groups other than their own, especially when these individuals are not present or otherwise able to represent themselves. And to build on that and to take in some of the lessons that I've taken, to be an ally should cost you something, right? To be an ally means you have more power and privilege than someone else, and you're being asked to use it to support someone, to protect someone, to uplift someone. It's a title that can only be bestowed upon you by another. Nobody is going, hopefully, on LinkedIn and talking about, their job title as an ally. You want to be seen as an ally to the groups that you are showing up as an ally for. And it involves recognizing power and privilege on a systemic, out in society, organizational, where I work, where I play, and individual level. You know that you have that power and privilege to be able to show up as an ally. And it's something you get to do, not something you have to do, right? Like I, as a tall, straight white man, have a lot of privilege in my life, and I don't necessarily need to take up these causes. But women, people of color, trans people, folks with disabilities, like they're advocating for themselves to be seen, to be heard, to be listened to get the supports and the equity that they need in society. That news channel that we say, oh, I'm fatigued by this news, that's their everyday life and lived experience. So that's some things I think we need to keep in mind about allyship as well too. And this idea that if we cannot, as aspiring allies, especially as male allies, recognize that there is systemic privilege, that there is organizational privilege, and we're just leveraging that, and we're not actually changing why we have it, we're just perpetuating benevolent sexism. This idea that as men, we should be protectors and providers, and women come under our protection and we provide opportunities. That's not allyship, right? That's still perpetuating a lot of that power structure and status quo. And when we have those conversations around protection, we're not talking about closing the wage gap. We're not talking about elevating women into leadership or men taking steps back into more caregiving roles, whether that's for children or for elders, and taking up those leaves available. And just a quick chart that really struck me of like, how do we show that there's this benevolent sexism that exists in our community? 2 out of 3 men, so 62%. And Kip, that's a great question. If you throw that in the Q&A, I'd love to get into that at the end of it there. 2 out of 3 men would be willing to help a woman in distress whose house burned down. But fewer men, 45%, would donate money to a woman whose business burned down. Yet, if you look at the graph here between male donors to male recipients, they're just as likely, if not more likely, to support men standing there on their own with a business. But for women, it's more of kind of a handout for shelter. So I thought this was a really neat example of how benevolent sexism plays out. And so what happens with this conversation is we have both a gender binary as a masculine and a feminine, but we also have a hierarchy where when we look at some of these traits here, strong, rational, assertive, competitive, tough, dominant, in our society and culture, they're held in higher value than the flip side of them, which is sensitive, emotional, cooperative, empathetic, right? And so, you know, when we are not looking critically about that power and privilege, that is the hierarchy that we're trying to change, right? So we have to be uplifting the feminine values as equally valued here. And the important thing to note in this as well, too, is sure, we can talk about gender specifically, but these ideas that we have and that we show up with are framed by our sex and gender, our race and ethnicity, our age, our nationality, our religious affiliation. That's where we get a lot of these scripts and these narratives that form how we show up into these conversations. And so the next way that I think that we can change the way we see, act, and think about masculinity, where we're really challenging that idea of the patriarch, is having this beneficiary argument here. And to have this conversation challenging the patriarch, I like to define patriarchy. It's pater, father, archaim, power, father power. And that power is handed down to us from generations prior. If we look at even just, you know, our fathers, our grandfathers, and our great-grandfathers, and we think about the roles that women played in those societies, whether that was in breadwinning capacities, in political leadership capacities, in household capacities, 3 generations later to where we are today, we've seen a lot of change. And then thinking back about how some of those conversations haven't changed among men, I think we're in a moment right now where masculinity is between stories, but we haven't seen that generational change as pronounced. And often these conversations around patriarchy are really framed about how does patriarchy benefit men and boys. And I would like to add a piece today of how does patriarchy harm men and boys. And I'm going to prep you for it. This is a little bit of an audience engagement portion. I would love to know what you think the 2021 Canadian gender wage gap. For every dollar that a man made in a role, how many cents did a woman make in a similar role? For every dollar that a man made, Alex with 82, Veronica with 83, Jacqueline with 87. They're coming in. Okay, we're seeing some good range. Let's play Price is Right rules, closest without going over. It's 89 cents. I see Farnaz came in with 89 on the dot. Who else got 89? V, you can shout some people out for getting close. And so for comparable work, for a dollar that a man made, a woman was paid 89 cents. And the tough part with this gender wage gap, I don't know, you all are at Moneris, you work with transactions and dollar figures and statistics potentially. You can look and change statistics in a bunch of different ways. And we've had economists trying to close the wage gap as much as possible. But this 11-cent gap seems very stubborn. And what they've named this gap is the motherhood penalty. And so when women are progressing in their careers, specifically at the time that they start families, and it's not women starting families, it's when families begin, and there's often a man in this role as well too, women are often penalized for it because they lose prime time for promotions and earning potential and recognition and those types of things. So this 11-cent gap is really stubborn. But what is also important to flag about this is often a white man to a white woman. When we look at a white man to an indigenous woman, or a settler woman to a newcomer woman, the numbers can be quite large and quite disparate. Now, there's about, I think, 190 recognized countries by the United Nations globally. And so what percentage of those countries would you say have a female head of state? So their president or their prime minister is a woman. What percentage? 12%, 35%, 8%, 7%, 0.5%, 27%. All right. And so before I reveal this number, I just want to remind everyone that women are 51% of the global population. So if we had gender equality, it would be 51%. It's 11.4%. So there's a 40% delta between women's representation globally in terms of population and their representation as global heads of state. And what's important to note with this as well too is this is president and prime minister. There's vice representation, there's Congress, there's Senate, there's all of these other bodies as well too. And so women are underrepresented at the top, but within those bodies, there's variable amounts as well too. Now, lastly, the Fortune 500. So these are like the 500 most influential companies that are driving the global economy. We often invest our retirement funds in them. They're very impactful. What percentage of the Fortune 500, so that's 500 potential CEOs, is female? Let's see, 3, 26, 5, 10, 5, 7, 10.6%. And the reason there's an asterisk on this number is this is an all-time high. And we reached that last year. 10.6%, all-time high of the most influential companies in the world. And so what is important for me to highlight about this conversation is that this is a conversation we have often about women's disadvantage in this. And the inverse of women's disadvantage is men's advantage, right? That's the conversation we have a lot about patriarchy. And what's really important to note is behavioral economics shows that we as human beings are more likely to take action to prevent a loss than we are to invest in a gain. And so when men are constantly reminded about how we're advantaged in this system, in this culture, and then someone says we should give that up, we get really protective about it as well too. But there's another opportunity for us to frame this conversation in a different way. And it's actually how patriarchy, the status quo that men, as we see in the slide prior, benefit from, having conversations about how we're harmed by it. And so 3 out of 4 suicides in Canada are male. How many suicides do you think occur in Canada on an annual basis? It's a bit of a morbid statistic, so apologies for that. Got 12,000, 2,000, 1,000, 3,000, thousands. That's correct. There's 4,000 people who in Canada die by suicide on an annual basis. That means that 3,000 of that 4,000 are men. And the reality is, a couple of years ago, suicide was the second leading cause of death of young men, only after accidents but the vast majority of male suicide is actually men 55 to 65. It's men who've bought into a narrative of what their life and what they would sacrifice to get out of their life, who then later on in their life, potentially they're divorced, potentially they're facing retirement and they don't know what value they have beyond a breadwinner, et cetera, et cetera. They haven't gotten what they've been sold, right? Men also live 4 to 5 years shorter than women. A lot of that is due to increased risk taking, whether that's career wise or those types of things. But a lot of it, I think, not to be too prescriptive, but I bet many of us could look to our families and hear about a father, an uncle, a grandfather who, was ill for a period of time and didn't seek help and health, and unfortunately ended up in like stage 4 cancer, or sometimes it's just too late. I know that my partner lost her father when she was 9 years old, very similar, because he had a form of cancer in his mouth and he didn't seek help for that. And then the reality is that men are the primary perpetrators of all forms of violence, but outside of gender-based violence, men are actually the primary victims of all other forms of violence, the hands of other men, right? And I don't know the other men on this call, how they feel about this. There's this quote that we use sometimes in our work at Next Gen Men. And I very much remember it from elementary school. You learn early on that other men and boys, every conversation, every confrontation with them is a potential fist fight. And you never forget that, right? And so men are steeped in this culture of violence. Somewhere between 75 to 81%, depending on what province you're looking at, of opioid deaths and overdoses and drug poisonings across Canada are men. The vast majority of folks struggling with homelessness and living on the streets and that type of crime are men. On provincial levels to federal levels, somewhere between 83 and 92% of those incarcerated are men. And so as a class of men, when it comes to wages and representation in politics and within the economy, men are, as a class, benefit. But we see here just how much men are harmed in the status quo of patriarchy. And then again, bringing back that conversation of behavioral economics, men are more likely, not men, sorry, people are more likely to take action to prevent a loss. And so these are tremendous losses that men are facing, that we can invite them into a conversation about this. Oh, my slide's not sliding. And I heard this quote after we started Next Gen Men, but it's just so perfect about why we do what we do and about this conversation. The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of men is not that toward women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. And if an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. That is the root of why we do what we do. And so the last way that we can move the conversation and bring more men into it is what I call stakeholder engagement, and what we call here healing the stoic. And so I have this timeline here, and I call it the paper cuts of patriarchy timeline. And as we walk through this together, I want you to just think of a boy in your life. It could be your son, it could be a nephew, it could be you when you were growing up, or just a boy that you know kind of out there in society. And this is what happens with boys and broadly conversations about masculinity. And it starts before children are born. We do these things called gender reveals. And thankfully, hopefully, we're not starting forest fires like they did in California some years ago. I don't know if anyone here is watching the NBA playoffs. As mentioned, I'm a basketball player. The Oklahoma City Thunder are led by Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, tremendous Canadian basketball player. But there's another guy on his team named Gordon Hayward. And Gordon Hayward had a video go viral a few years back. He already had either 2 or 3 daughters, and they did a gender reveal for another child that they were expecting. A pretty simple one, just a box. It opens, some balloons float up. And, um, you know, his wife is videotaping. It happens. They're pink balloons. And she turns to him and she says, "Is daddy happy?" And he goes, "Daddy's always happy." And you could just see how disappointed he was to have another daughter. And that doesn't mean that he's not going to love her and she's not going to have a great home. But there's these hopes and dreams and expectations we put on these tiny human beings before they even come and introduce themselves to us. And so that happens to girls and to boys. And that's that narrative of boys equal blue before they're even born. And then if we look at young boys before the age of 5, there's this thing called the father wound. And, early on when the child is a newborn, we all goo, we gaw, we hold, we cuddle them. There's this great joke about a politician when you hand a baby, I think it was Barack Obama, and he says, when a baby hands you a telephone, you answer it. But the reality is that men start physically distancing themselves from sons, from boys, early on in their lives. So if a boy is growing up, he will feel that his father, his grandfather, his uncles start physically distancing themselves from the hugging, the holding, the cuddling, where their mothers, their grandmothers, their sisters don't do that. And it's very confusing. They don't have the language or the concept to understand that. They just know that there's an intimacy gap there. And so that's often referred to the father wound. And then we, socialize our young boys often with this language of boys will be boys, they're rambunctious, they have a lot of energy, and then we send them off to school. And we're seeing that a lot of boys are struggling specifically in early childhood education, which is a very female dominant field. And I say this with like no ill will to the educators, but if you're a woman who grew up in a time when you knew you needed to be twice as good to get half as far, you're going to have natural concern for your girls in your classroom. But they've been socialized to be able to sit and to socialize and to pay attention, to thrive in those early childhood spaces where maybe boys have not had the same social emotional supports at home. And so we're seeing boys being diagnosed at drastic rates with behavioral issues and really struggling in school. And there's an author named Richard Reeves who's proposing redshirting boys, actually holding them back a year to start school later than girls. I think it's not an issue of chronological age. I do believe it's an issue of social emotional learning supports from a young age. But boys may have a lot of emotion around that, and when they're having this energy, they might skin their knee. And I remember being at basketball practice, and our coach brought his son sometimes, and one of his son fell and skinned his knee. And he came to his dad with tears in his eyes, and his father just shook his head and said, "That didn't hurt." And through tears in his eyes, he had to say, "That didn't hurt." And so we learned this lesson early on: boys don't cry. And then we socialize boys, like I said, through my basketball practice example. There's, hockey, sports, those types of things. A lot of boys learn what it is to be a man in those settings. And, we're pushed to the limits. And I believe in competition, but oftentimes I feel, we're pushed to perform in certain ways that, if we don't push through, we're not manning up, or we're not man enough. A great example, a couple of years ago, the Calgary Flames were in the playoffs, and only after the playoffs ended did we learn that our defenseman Chris Tanev had a fully separated shoulder that he played through, and everyone celebrated him for doing so. But I have to ask, what are the consequences to his family life? What are the consequences to him post career? Will it impact his earning potential in his next contract? Those types of things. So there's a lot of external pressure of how we should show up to man up. And then as a coming of age, we talk a lot about losing your virginity as becoming a man, and those types of things. And in a lot of heterosexual relationships, girls are in relationship with boys, and boys start to see the entire relationship through that lens, and perhaps they find themselves with a young woman who may entertain the idea. And through the statistics, we see that the vast majority of women's first experiences are not what they had imagined. Not necessarily sexual assault, but not what they had hoped or imagined for themselves. And the reality is, when you get a young man and you look at this timeline who has been physically distanced from intimacy, who's been told his emotions don't matter, and that when he faces resistance or there's something to overcome, that he needs to man up and push through. And you see a young man in that moment, he doesn't have the skills or the support to show up in that relational moment the way that we would hope to. And I don't say that to excuse it. I say that to point to the opportunities where we can improve that journey. And then as men enter into post-secondary and workplaces, there's this joke that men are assigned their friends, and this is true for me as well. One of my closest friend groups is my roommates that were assigned to me in first year of university. And so we socialize in that school or kind of sport context, but then we enter the real world. And we've got this joke, haha, we lost one, the first guy gets engaged or married, haha, we lost one, the first guy becomes a father, and then haha, we lost one, first guy separates. Through men's lives, they're facing these moments where if they're not moving at the same pace of their friend group, they become a bit isolated. And men aren't picking up new friendships later in life, because to be with another man and to say, hey, I enjoyed spending time with you, did you enjoy spending time with me? That level of vulnerability we don't see happening in conversations. And then this, hustle and grind, and we think about that story that men buy into. If I behave this way, if I do these things, if I make these sacrifices, we're seeing again that vast proportion of male suicide, 55 to 65. I did these things. Why am I not getting these outcomes out of this relationship, this money, this social status? There's a level of entitlement and betrayal in that kind of breeds over time, and men get more and more isolated. There's statistics that show vast majority of men over age 50 can't identify a single best friend. And that's very troublesome. And a lot of men also struggle then when their romantic relationships end later in life, because they don't have social networks to lean on. And so these are the paper cuts of patriarchy. They can seem a bit extreme when laid out on a timeline this way, but as we sat back and we imagined this boy, I think hopefully we can see the pressures that men face as they grow out of boyhood into manhood and through their lives. And not only is this a thing that happens over the duration of your life, there's also this hierarchy. If you remember, there was the gender binary and the gender hierarchy. Within the masculinity piece on top of that, there's also this tension around what type of masculinity and how we should show up as men. And a little bit of gender nerding out here, but at the top of Raywin Connell's hierarchy is this idea of hegemonic masculinity. And what I want you to keep in mind as I use that term is 007, right? And he is fit, fashionable, fast cars, beautiful women, rich, affluent. but there's only one 007. There's a 006, there's a 008. We don't hear about them. There's no movie franchise about them. There's one 007. And so it's a competition to get to the top because socially that is the most valued form of masculinity, right? We see that in our media, in our movies, in our conversation. Then beneath that is what we call complicit masculinities, which is average Joes. It's like someone who appreciates fashion or who has a fast car. They may not have that complete package because there can only be one 007, but because they are striving for pieces of that, they don't fight the overall idea that that's the ideal way to be a man. And then beneath that, we have marginalized masculinities. And I use Idris Elba as an example here. He's a tremendous actor, and there was a whole conversation about him becoming potentially the next 007. But the big pushback was that he was a black man. And so, within our cultural layers and intersectionality, even if you are a man and a masculine man who has a lot of these valued traits, if you have other aspects of your identity, you're lower in the hierarchy of masculinities. And then at the bottom of this kind of masculinities piece, which you can imagine just above the femininity piece, is what we call subordinate masculinities. And, there's this huge uproar right now about trans individuals and drag queens, people who are just saying, you know what, traditional masculinity, not for me. I'm going to play with it. I'm going to make it something fun and something interchangeable for myself. And so when we have this competition to get to the top of this pyramid, people who are just not participating are obviously on kind of the bottom part of that. And so whether it's kind of like that timeline I shared with you or the hierarchy, all of this comes together into a culture of competition and domination that us as men experience through our lives. And then, we think about, okay, if I subscribe to this, if I play the game that is put in front of me, what is there at the end of it? Hopefully there's, a good family life, a good retirement, and those types of things. But we're seeing a lot of men who have multiple marriages and divorces, or their kids are estranged from them later in life, or they're one bad day away from a heart attack because they're so stressed and they're so overworked. Is that an ideal form of masculinity? Is that actually what we should be striving towards? And this is why I firmly believe we need that parallel conversation, opening up men's roles and identities in society in parallel with the conversations we're having for women and girls. And so I'm going to land this plane here so that we have a little bit of time for Q&A, but here's some lessons I've learned from 9 years of meeting boys and men where they are. One is that allyship is not enough. That's why we're having a conversation of moving beyond male allies. Men aren't apart from the conversation. And hopefully you see that. We're part of the conversation about the gender paradigm. We need to be in it. We need to be stakeholders, right? Otherwise, we're just perpetuating benevolent sexism, which upholds the status quo. This work is anti-patriarchal because the system harms people of all genders and is also upheld by people of all genders. Oftentimes, I think we make men out to be villains in this, but it's a structure that, my grandmother was extremely deferential to my grandfather and supported him being that way. I remember selling socks at a friend's, he had a sock company. I was supporting him and his market. And there was these funky Saved by the Bell, teal, purple, orange with shapes. And this boy was really excited about it. And he grabbed the socks and he turned to his mom, and his mom said, no, those are girl socks, right? So women are also upholding this structure of patriarchy. And I personally call myself a feminist, and Next Gen Men is a feminist organization. I don't necessarily mean that everyone should call themselves that, but hopefully we can all be anti-patriarchal in this system work. And then lastly, we've been having a great conversation where we raise our daughters more like our sons. But until we raise our sons more like our daughters and we normalize the breadth of human experience and expression and emotion, we're going to be stuck in having these spinning out conversations. And so lastly, from my grandmother, I learned to be a gentleman. From my grandfather, I learned to be a patriarch. From my father, I learned to be a stoic. But through my own learning, unlearning, and ultimately healing, I've become a stakeholder. And this is why we need fewer male allies and more male stakeholders. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll pass it over to Veronica to help support some Q&A.
Amazing. Thanks, Jake. All right. So first question, I think we're going back to kind of the start. I'm not 100% remembering the context, but Kip was wondering, why is caregiving considered taking a step back? And I'm guessing that's in reference to like the labor force. So I'm going to let you go with that.
Yeah, and I mean, like Kip, I'll take that as a call in. Like I'm still dealing with my own socialization and programming about this, where that's the language we use. We talk about women taking steps back and out of the workforce. And like, amen. Thanks for pointing that out. I think we should talk about it as stepping forward into our families, and supporting our communities, because like we're all born of families and parents who started families, and society is built on that. So, you know, whether it's our workplaces, our governments, our communities, we all need to be supportive of families and caregiving, especially as we look at us being the sandwich generation currently. We're a generation that is both supporting our children and our parents simultaneously. So we need help around caregiving. So, you know, I don't think that it's like an institutional term, stepping out. I think there's my own bias and socialization that I used in saying that. So I appreciate you pointing it out.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, next we have a question. It says, I'm a woman and have one son who's 10 years old. I feel that we're deconstructing who men are. Women complain about how men or dads or husbands aren't doing enough. We want rich, intelligent, fit, and caring, nurturing, etc. My question is, are we, and mostly women, asking too much from men? How can women raise better sons without sending contradictory messages?
Oh, such a good question. I don't think we're asking too much, because women have been facing this as well, right? I think societally we're asking too much of everyone, right? And that's like a capitalism issue, right? We used to be able to have a society and culture where, you know, maybe there was a breadwinner and you could afford a mortgage and a decent life. Nowadays, we're seeing we need two people working in that sense. And women are, on the one hand, stepping into the workforce and becoming earners and breadwinners for their families. But then they're also bombarded on Instagram and Pinterest with like how they need to show up as like moms and partners and activity planners. And so women have had this conversation of too much for a really long time. And so men may have been able to kind of dodge that conversation in the workplace by just, you know, playing that role. But yeah, we're asking them to be, you know, caring and committed fathers and do more in that sense. And so now everyone is just facing this stress and this anxiety of, you know, having to do too much. So I think, you know, how is it that we can find, and this is why I think gender equity is so important, right? How do we in our own familial unit figure that out, but not also just burden individuals? How do we as organizations support those conversations? How do we as governments support those conversations? Like we need to be seeking that balance, and I think that underpins that. And as a mother, you know, my heart goes out to people raising next gen men these days, because boys are getting conflicting messages. On the one hand, how they should show up, and, you know, post Me Too and you know, high on consent and high on healthy relationships and those types of things. But then their peers or their sports coaches or, you know, internet influencers are saying this is what a man is and we need to claim this. And if you're a young man trying to figure it out, you're kind of looking at these things and you're like, I can't be both. I'm struggling. And so I think there's a lot more we can do as communities to support young men as well too. And we're seeing that, you know, we're seeing that with our youth programs and the requests that are coming in and whatnot. So I hope I answered all that. Veronica, I don't know if there was anything else in there that I didn't speak to.
No, it's great. I think maybe we have only one more we can answer before we'll turn it back to Neetu actually for closing remarks. So I like this question. So I'm going to go with this one next. So Farnaz is asking, opening channels for men is a great idea, but often the emotional labor of these falls on women. How do you recommend we navigate the space without taking on the emotional labor of these conversations? So be it with family, coworkers, friends, and so on.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll fully admit that like when I was going through my struggles in my early 20s, like I did lean a lot on my female partner, and she did a lot of emotional labor for me. Um, but I think I would like to hope that I now have the capacity to do that emotional labor for others, because I've learned some skills, some words, and the ability to do that. But it's difficult, and I think that's why when we frame it as men as allies, they're kind of apart from the conversation. But when we name it as men as stakeholders, they can come step into the conversation and own their own struggle with this narrative and the idea of masculinity being between stories. And some of the ways that we do that at Next Gen Men, not to pump our own stuff, is 4 years ago I started a book club. It's called Book Club, but it's an acronym for Beyond Our Own Knowledge. And the origins of it was after the murder of George Floyd. I was really kind of pissed off with people posting black squares on social media, because I knew that was the extent of what they were going to do, and the black community was saying, hey, like, educate yourselves on systemic racism. And so I invited, I put a post on social media and I said, I'm looking for 10 non-black men to read a book by a black author and discuss it with me. And I ended up with 27 guys. And I think the more opportunities that we take to do our own learning and unlearning, and elevate ourselves, the better we can show up in those moments, because then it's not someone doing the emotional labor for us, it's us doing emotional labor for each other. I think that men need to be able to hold space for the pain and struggle that people of other genders, women, trans, non-binary people, are experiencing. But then we also can hold empathy and space for some of the harms that men are experiencing. But such a good question, and we all have a role to play.
Amazing. Thanks, Jake. I'm going to turn it over to Neetu.
Thank you so much, Jake. I just want to say that was really powerful, and I love listening to you, because I think that it really reminded me of a lot of the work that we've been doing here at Moneris since last year, with some of the men's listening sessions, where we talked openly and vulnerably with men about mental health, the emotional repression that they've been living with their whole lives, not knowing how to get in touch with their own emotions so that they can then be there for the emotions of other people. And a lot of this is like a journey to connecting more with yourself, right? And it gets hard for men sometimes to approach DI, because it can often for them feel like they're going to be bashed, or that they're going to say the wrong thing and then be canceled or whatever. And so for us, I hope everyone listening, this was an opportunity to grow some empathy and compassion for how patriarchy, as you said earlier, Jake, affects people of all gender identities, perhaps to different extents and different magnitudes, for sure. I think that the point that you made earlier was a really valid one, which is, my team's been talking a lot lately about dissecting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, something that I want to give a shout out to Monica, good luck on my team, who helped sort of frame it as like, diversity is really about who is present and participating, whether it's in an organization or in the labor market or in the household. But equity is around like their social location, right? Where are they actually sitting within that entity or that society? And so when it comes to the realms of power and money, men tend to dominate, and they tend to be the dominant gender in terms of making money, leading companies, leading countries, as we saw through the statistics. And women really are disadvantaged in that regard, whether it's through the motherhood penalty, or even women without children, older women, all kinds of different trans women, queer women, newcomer women. But when it comes to the I, inclusion, we see that men, along with women and gender diverse folks, are also suffering. and perhaps suffering to a greater extent, where they don't even have a single person that they could call on as a friend later in life, whether they're, you know, struggling with mental health, and suicide rates are so high for men. And so I hope this sort of brings home to everyone the picture of how DEI is for all of us. It's not just for women and gender diverse folks. This is about our liberation, regardless of our gender identity. And when we can heal ourselves and connect with ourselves, we can actually show up and practice allyship for others. And so it's sort of a working inside out. I also recognize that the topics that were touched on today were heavy. And for some people who identify as men, maybe the first time you've ever had these types of conversations ever, or especially like in a workplace setting. So please look after yourself. We have wellness resources available through Inkblot and through our wellness team, and also through Sun Life. So if some of these topics were triggering for individuals, anyone listening, but especially for the men today, I encourage you to sort of take care of yourself, take space to sort of reflect on what this means for you. Because I know some of these topics can be really difficult, especially if they're topics that you're not sort of allowed to think about or talk about that often. But yeah, and
Me too. If I could add one thing there.
Yeah.
When I was 22 and I was going through like the worst of it and self-harming and those types of things, it was my father's company employee assistance program that was my first kind of resource into these types of things. So I just want to like double click on what you said. Those programs exist. They support people. They could be part of the healing journey. So I'm really glad that you said that.
Yeah, and I know we didn't get to all the questions, but someone had mentioned that they have a partner who's male and struggling with their mental health. And so remember that when you think about, you know, your 5 Moneris paid sessions, those are not just for you, they're also for your family members that can be leveraged in terms of guiding you in terms of how to support them. Again, but to Farnaz's point, not to drown yourself through the emotional labor of that. Your programs also extend to your dependents through Sun Life. So think about how you can leverage those mental health supports for the people that you love and that you care about. I also think as leaders, for those of you who are people leaders, by talking about mental health, we normalize it, we create safe spaces. It's really powerful to see a man, especially a white man, who's cisgender, heterosexual, talk about mental health. That creates space for other men of all marginalized identities to also do that. And lastly, I just want to encourage everyone who participated today, if you identify as a man, please check out the Next Gen Men Book Club. It's a really powerful community for men to have those vulnerable conversations, to learn and connect in a safe space with other men. Thank you so much, Veronica. Thank you, Daman, for all your hard work in making this event happen. Thank you to all of you who attended. And most of all, thank you so much, Jake. This was recorded, and we will be sharing the replay as well with everyone. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.